There is a light at the end of this road, and I know that there's still a long way to go. As long as my head is high and I walk with pride, go with the strength inside, take every step in stride. No chance will pass me by, long as I always try, won't let my passions die. And as long as I'm alive, the future belongs to me.
Greetings, teachers, and thank you for the honor of your time, because I know it is what you have the least amount of. And so it's a pleasure to be here with you for this module. My name is Christy Norris. I am the director of Carolina K-12, which is a program of Carolina Public Humanities at UNC Chapel Hill. And our mission is to serve you with free, high quality professional development, curriculum, and resources, reaching out to teachers in all 100 counties of the state. And let me just say, most importantly, thank you for your service in the classroom. So the purpose of this hour-long module on teaching hard history is to take a break from all the controversy and rhetoric and politicization, and to really just begin to think about what this might actually look like in your classroom and how to do this successfully. And also to think about why this is of absolute critical importance. While we consider the importance, we're also going to provide some very specific examples of what this might look like when you teach hard history in the classroom. We want to be really clear about what we're talking about. We're going to talk about some examples and some strategies of how to ensure your success, which in turn will also help ensure the success of your students. We want our young leaders walking away feeling empowered and interested and heartened and not deflated and hopeless. We'll also acknowledge some of the challenges. We know that you have a lot of worries and that you sometimes face fears in your communities about doing this work. And so we're going to offer some ways to prepare yourself and your classrooms for maximum positive impact. So before we go any further, I want to do something that I hope that you'll in turn do in your own classrooms. And that is to ground yourself in some intention. Our advisory board member, Eric Johnson, recently wrote in an op-ed that our history is neither an unbroken march of progress nor a doomed loop of despair. It's a complicated mess, just like the present. And having a sense of curiosity about where we came from is an act of civic pride. So if you believe that schools are places where we are educating our future leaders, if you believe that schools are places where students learn what to love about their country and where they develop a sense of pride, if you believe that schools are places where students should develop critical thinking skills, then you believe in teaching hard history. The intention of teaching hard history, as we at Carolina K-12 see it, it's not about shame and blame. It's about calling people in rather than calling people out in anger and defensiveness. It's about coming together to learn in the spirit of hope and in the spirit of reconciliation. So a quick note before we dive in on how we at Carolina K-12 define hard history. We define hard history as basically the historical topics, events, periods that are hard. It usually involves a combination of violence or injustice, oppression, racism, genocide, grief or pain or trauma, and it often reverberates into the present. And hard history, because it's hard, can often trigger denial, defensiveness, and really fundamental disagreements over who we are and what values we hold. And, in some ways, it's almost easier to get huffy about it, to fuss about it, rather than actually buckle down and do the work that facing it requires of us. Anger and drama can fill up all that space.
And that space instead should really be filled by reconciliation. So we need to think about that and be careful about that.
We know that many of you often worry about how to cover hard history. You worry about its impact on your students. You don't want to do harm. You don't want to further traumatize students. You worry about how parents might respond. These days, you worry about how politicians might respond. It's really just because these histories are, in fact, hard and complicated that you might not feel like you have all of the content knowledge yourself to delve into this safely. Because the fact is, you yourself may not have been taught a full and comprehensive history in your own education. So let me be explicitly clear as we move forward about what Carolina K-12 promotes in teaching hard history, and specifically what we believe teaching hard history is and what teaching hard history isn't.
So hard history is not political, though it is sadly being politicized. It is not biased or leftist to teach the truth, to encourage students to examine primary sources, to think critically. We're not telling them what to think. This is about teaching them how to think because they are our future leaders. Hard history is not indoctrination. Let me say that again for the folks in the back. Hard history is not indoctrination. It is the opposite of indoctrination. Again, this is about teaching students how to think, how to analyze, how to seek proof and truth and perspective. That is the exact opposite of indoctrination. Besides, we all know if we could indoctrinate somebody, it would be do your homework, stop talking through my whole class. So look, hard history also, it shouldn't be divisive. It doesn't have to be divisive. We can work to find the things that we have in common rather than wallow in what drives us apart. And I believe that includes hard history. And I will say, if kids are leaving your classroom feeling shame and blame or some form of paralyzing guilt, all of which are terribly disempowering, something isn't being conveyed correctly. Yes, students should feel. They should feel many things because, after all, history is a place where we can develop empathy. But, whether it's sadness or regret or disappointment or whatever feelings hard history might rightfully invoke, there needs to be a focus on hope and empowerment and resilience. That is where the power is. And we'll talk more in just a minute about framing your teaching of hard history in this way. And hard history is not critical race theory. We are not responding to that dog whistle because none of us are teaching law school courses. It is also not anti-American. Teaching hard history is an act of courage, of love, and of civic pride. If it has been any of these things in your classroom, which I'm pretty sure it hasn't been, but again, this module is full of recommendations on how to center this work in a productive and reconciliatory way. So what is hard history? Teaching hard history is patriotic. When you love something or someone, you do anything and everything to push them to live up to their potential. Look, I'm the mother of an 8-year-old who I adore with every fiber of my being. And those of us who are parents and teachers and just good humans, we know that we show love by holding our children and our students accountable. When my little boy messes up, I call him on it. If he is disrespectful, if he punches somebody out on the playground, if he bullies or mouths off, I call him out on it, but in a way that he learns from his mistakes. Because by holding him accountable, I help ensure he doesn't repeat his mistakes because I want him to grow and be better. He's only 8. So if I ignore those mistakes and misbehaviors and miss those teachable moments, if I just gloss over every wrong thing he does or says and just think that he's 100% wonderful all the time, he's going to be a spoiled brat. And so similarly, America is still so young and she's growing. And if we love her, we have to hold her accountable. And so I'll just transition with words from the great W.E.B. Du Bois, who said, "Nations reel and stagger on their way. They make hideous mistakes. They commit frightful wrongs. They do great and beautiful things. And shall we not best guide humanity by telling the truth about all of this, so far as the truth is ascertainable?" And so, in this module, we're going to talk about specific recommendations for teaching hard history. So, as I mentioned earlier, it is really important that you ground yourself, that you ground your students and even your parents in what your intention is. The intention that we promote is that of reconciliation and hope. And the great Ida B. Wells Barnett said, "The way to right past wrongs is to shine the light of truth upon them."
So, with our intention set, I want to pause here just for a moment and share an exemplar from North Carolina history whose story really encompasses so much of what I've been talking about so far. And his story also is just simply incredible. And every single teacher must know and teach about this man because he personifies resistance and hope. And I'm talking about North Carolina's own Abraham Galloway. So Galloway was born enslaved in 1837 North Carolina, and after 19 years of enslavement, he escapes at age 19 via a ship from Wilmington. So that alone is an incredible enough feat. But then he spends the next years going back into the South and helping other enslaved people escape to the North. As the Civil War begins, he spends his mid-20s setting up a network of spies in the South for the Union, like literally James Bond kind of stuff. And he becomes such a well-known and respected leader throughout the Black community that when the time comes to try to start recruiting for North Carolina's colored troops regiments, he takes a major role in that. But he doesn't just blindly use his leadership to convince young Black men to sign up. He makes demands of the government before he agrees to recruit. He says that any colored regiment formed in New Bern needs to receive the same pay, the same uniforms, and the same rations as white. He says the Union needs to provide shelter and supplies, offer jobs to the families of Black soldiers. I love that he was adamant that schools for African Americans had to be opened and that education for Blacks had to be guaranteed. And he demanded that Black soldiers who should be treated by the Confederacy if captured as POWs and not as escaped slaves. So thousands of Black people end up joining the Union effort largely because of Galloway's leadership. But he wasn't done. On September 29, 1865, Galloway helps to lead the Freedmen's Convention right here in Raleigh, North Carolina. And of course, as you know, in 1868, he's elected state senator in North Carolina as part of the first group of African American representatives elected. And what does he do in the General Assembly? He works for labor rights. He fights for minimum wages. He introduces the first amendments for women's suffrage. So these are just a few of the things he did, but what an incredible story of a man born into enslavement who had been forbidden to learn to read or write, and he becomes one of the most influential men in North Carolina. So why am I telling you, begging you to teach about him? In addition to the fact that he was just amazing, he really represents that resistance and that resilience and that hope that I've been talking about and that you're going to hear me keep stressing throughout our time together. And I want to play just a quick 4-minute clip from historian David Soselski, in which he also talks about Galloway's personality, his life view, because I think that's also really important to what I'm trying to push here. So here's a clip, David Soselski, 4 minutes, talking about the personality, the life views of Abraham Galloway.
A North Carolina war hero was nearly erased from our history.
I mean, he was probably the most important African-American leader anywhere in the South during the Civil War.
His name is Abraham Galloway. He escaped slavery, worked as a spy for the Union Army, built a network of spies throughout the South, fought against the Ku Klux Klan, and became one of the first African Americans elected to office.
When he did speaking tours of the North, he didn't introduce Frederick Douglass as the main speaker of the night. Frederick Douglass introduced him as the main speaker of the night.
Galloway was born in 1837 in what is now Southport. It's a village south of Wilmington. When he died in 1870, his funeral was the largest in North Carolina history. But a few decades later, his legacy had been dismantled and his memory pushed into the shadows.
Is that if we can miss Abraham Galloway, and nobody knew who he was 10 years ago, 20 years ago, who knows what else we've missed. I think particularly for young people, for students, the excitement and the importance of that kind of historical discovery awaits them. And I don't just mean, yes, with African American history, but also all kinds of things. Is that in many ways we've been denied much of the best parts of our past and places and things that happen that we can draw strength from, inspiration from, get a better vision of who we are as we try to fashion a future in this crazy new world that we're in. One of the great joys to me in learning about Galloway's life, and one that I try to apply in my life today, is that Galloway was a slave for more than half of his life. He never learned to read or write. He never had time. It was illegal to teach a slave to read or write, and then after the war, he was too busy. He was constantly his life was constantly under threat while he was a slave, constantly under threat when he's fighting for African American freedom in the North, constantly under threat when he's a spy behind enemy lines. There's at least 2 assassination attempts, and probably more after the war. He was being threatened constantly. His life was being threatened. And through it all, Galloway was serious business. But as the New York Times quoted him, said of him, it said, he laughed loud and often. He always had kind of a flair and a joy in the moment that transcended the struggle that he was part of. He laughed, he made fun of, he was vain, he loved how he looked. He says, he accepted that struggling against oppression was the nature of human life, and that you could both struggle and, laugh loud and often. That it was not that this was whatever brief life he had. He was like this flash of lightning across the sky. But it was struggle, but also a kind of joy. He did not look at the terrible things happening in the world like we sometimes do now and get depressed. And, he fought and he laughed loud and often.
So sadly, Abraham Galloway's life ended abruptly. He died at the age of 33 from fever and jaundice. And you have to wonder if he had lived longer. I know these can be dangerous things to ponder, but had he lived longer, would the 1898 Wilmington coup have taken place in the exact same way that it did? I don't know. He was such a strong leader in the Wilmington area, in all of North Carolina. He would have been 61 years old in 1898. So it's just something to think about. But here might be a good moment for you to pause before we go any further and think about how you might apply this concept in planning your own classroom, your own curriculum when teaching hard history. So despite the hard parts of Galloway's life, slavery, unequal treatment of Confederate troops, lynching, and all the complicated mess that was part of the Civil War years, we can draw strength and inspiration and hope from this flash of lightning. So perhaps pause here, think about this for a little bit, or talk with a neighbor if you aren't locked in a room alone listening to me drone on and on about how crazy I am for this historical figure, and think about Abraham Galloway and how you might apply this concept in your classroom when teaching hard history. Moving on, let's drill down into what I think is the most important tenet of teaching hard history, a theme that will be woven throughout everything we look at and discuss in our short time together. And that is, again, to educate with hope and to empower. One of the great ways to do this is through oral histories. So I'm going to take a break and give space to the voice of the incredible North Carolina civil rights leader, Ben Chavis. You may know Ben Chavis as the young man who was an assistant to Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., or you might know him who, as a 23-year-old, rose to international prominence as the leader of the Wilmington 10. This was in 1971. The Wilmington 10 were civil rights activists who were wrongfully convicted of committing arson. Ben Chavis and his colleagues were eventually freed 9 years later in 1980. But he goes on to become the executive director of the NAACP. He does so much more. But I want to take you back in time and have you listen to him sharing his words about something he did when he was a 13-year-old boy in Oxford, North Carolina. This is just a 4-minute excerpt. And as you listen, I want you to jot down notes, just some quick thoughts there about how this excerpt represents resistance and hope in the face of the hard history of segregation.
I desegregated my local library when I was in elementary school in Oxford. We could not go to the local library. There was something called the Colored Annex next to the First Baptist Church in Oxford. And I always felt a sense of wanting to know why. I like to read. And in the colored school system, we had the hand-me-down books. So most of the textbooks that we used from when I was in the first grade through the 7th grade were hand-me-down books. I mean, books were not both covers. They had been used by the white school and passed on to the colored school system. And I knew that in the library there were all these books with both covers on it. I wanted a book with both covers. The day I went into the library, I was walking home from school. I think I was 13. I just turned 13. My birthday is January 22nd. I just turned 13. I was 12 and just turned 13. Walk home from school, and they had just built this brand new library called the Thornton Library in Oxford. And I knew that this library was built with tax money, but I knew my parents paid tax. I thought it was so unfair. But there were no signs saying white only. But people was just because it was known that this blacks were not supposed to go. I didn't like the fact that the adults in my community were so obedient to segregation. I wondered why are we not standing up to this? We don't have to divide. And I used to, in little small ways, I would go in the dime store, there would be a colored water fountain, white. I would always drink out of the white water fountain, not because I wanted white water, because just out of defiance. Mm-hmm. And so one day walking home from school, I just decided I'm going to get me a book of both covers today. And I went into the library. It was around 3:45 p.m. It was an elderly white woman in the library, and she said, "Oh, young man, you're in the wrong place. You're supposed to be at the annex." And I said, "No, ma'am. I'm not here to start any trouble. I just would like to get a book of both covers." And she said, "Aren't you Elizabeth's son?" That's my mother's. I said, "Yes, ma'am." I said, "Well, your mother's going to lose her job if you don't get out this library." And I said, "No, ma'am, I'm not trying to make my mother lose her job, but I'm not leaving until I get a book." So they called the police. They called my parents. By this time, a lot of my classmates from Mariposa High School were standing looking through the glass outside because they just knew that I was getting ready to go to jail. And I kind of be very honest, I thought I was getting ready to go too. I was very nervous. The police came, and they also got on the phone, called my parents, said, come and get your son. And one of the proudest days of my life, my parents got there. One of the things you need to know, I asked the librarian, I said, "How can I get it?" She said, "You can't check out a book if you don't have a library card." I said, "Well, what do I need to do to get a library card? She said, you have to fill out an application. I said, well, can I have it? I said, I'm not supposed to give you an application. I said, well, ma'am, while we are debating, can I at least fill out the paper and then we can decide whether or not you accept it? So she gave me the paper. I filled it out, handed it to her. And the police officer came, chided the librarian and said, you shouldn't have given him that paper. And the librarian said, well, what am I supposed to do? I kind of felt not sorry, but I was concerned that the librarian, I didn't want her to have a heart attack. It was just a very intense moment. You have almost now 100 students looking outside the building. Oxford's finest police officers there. So my parents arrived, both my mother and my father. And my mother said, what are you doing? I said, well, Mama, I said, I'm not trying to start no trouble. I said, I want to get a library card and I'd like to check out a book. And the librarian knew my mother, said, Elizabeth, can't you talk to your son? And my mother said, well, my son is right. So about 10 seconds of silence went by. The police standing there, my parents, I'm standing there. Who's going to make the next move? The elderly librarian grabbed the paper and says, I'm processing this application. She did what she did. There were no computers back then. I did typing the name on the card. She said, here, young man. I got the card. I went and immediately got the book, sat down. My friends were looking in. They stopped filing in to get their card, got the books. It was a great feeling to be able to read a book in the public library.
So wow, right? If you're with a partner, take a moment to chat about what that excerpt might mean to young people, or to any age for that matter, but why specifically might your young students connect with that, with him, this 13-year-old boy in Oxford, North Carolina? And what thoughts and themes did you jot down? How does this provide a platform for talking about resistance and hope while still teaching about the hard history of Jim Crow and segregation? So pause if you like, otherwise, let's move on. My next recommendation in many ways may be the most difficult, which is to cover a comprehensive and balanced narrative that acknowledges the complexity of our past and present. None of this is simple. Remember Eric Johnson's quote that I opened with, history is neither an unbroken march of progress nor a doom loop of despair. It's a complicated mess, just like the present. And I say this is perhaps most difficult because as teachers, our enemy is time. We're always having to make decisions on what to squeeze in, what to cover, what to let go. But as you make those hard choices, you have to always ask yourself, whose stories am I choosing to share and to elevate? Whose stories are invisible, are missing, are secondary? And why is that? And, these choices are going to look different based on who you are and who you teach and where you teach. But I think it's also really important that you always make sure your students see themselves in the history you teach and not just see themselves as victims, but as survivors and contributors and resistors and all of that just life and blood that makes up the story of us. So let's take a specific look again of how this might play out in your classroom. Traditionally, we teach segregation and Jim Crow in pretty black and white terms, literally and figuratively. And Indigenous people are often disappeared. In fact, this is a problem with the entire curriculum. If Native Americans only make an appearance in your curriculum during colonization, and then maybe they pop back up for the Trail of Tears, but then they're no more, that's a huge hole. Especially when North Carolina has the largest American Indian population east of the Mississippi River and the 8th largest Indian population in the United States. So now wait, if you're sitting there thinking, that's me, I made that mistake, it is okay. Remember, when you know better, you do better. We're all still constantly learning, constantly growing. So here's a great example of covering a comprehensive narrative during Jim Crow with North Carolina's Lumbee. Our lesson on this topic starts with students examining in whole class conversation with the teacher, because with a source like this that you're looking at there, wouldn't necessarily trust students to process it in partners or groups without me. But we asked them to look at this flyer, this primary source, and think about, simple things first. What do you see? What do you first notice? What strikes you? And then have students start to point out the information that is given. What do they think the purpose of the document is? What do they already know about the KKK? Do they have any idea why the Klan is holding a rally and cross burning? The date noted as January 18th. What year would your students guess that this took place? Where exactly is Maxton, North Carolina? So you probably know, and I'll tell you just in case, it crosses over Robeson and Scotland counties. And so why a rally in this particular location? Who was the Klan targeting? So this is one of my most favorite stories from North Carolina history. And this lesson that you take students through, they learn all about what becomes known as the Battle of Hayes Pond or the Battle of Maxton. So January 18th, 1958, a Klan rally was planned and held near Hayes Pond in Maxton, North Carolina. So what you need to know about this time period is there were actually many similar events taking place in this area, mainly because the county was very interesting. It was evenly divided and is largely still so today, with a third of the population being Lumbee, a third of the population being Black, and a third of the population being white. So many of these Klan events that started creeping up, including the January 18th rally, are organized by South Carolina Grand Dragon James Catfish Cole. And, in fact, just a few days before this January rally, Klansmen burned a cross at the home of a Lumbee woman who was rumored to have a relationship with a white man, because James Catfish Cole really could not stand, more than anything, could not stand the idea of what he called intermarrying. And so he claims that he's going to host this huge rally on January 18th, that 5,000 heavily armed Klansmen are going to be coming, and that the purpose of this rally was to remind the Lumbee Indians of, quote, their place in the racial order. So at this point, your students would get an article that they read in partners or read in reading circles. It's called The Night the Klan Met Its Match. So in this excerpt from the article that students read that you're looking at right now, you get a sense of what happened if you don't know the story. So Catfish predicts that 5,000 KKK members were going to come and put those Lumbees in their place. He was going to get the Lumbee to cow into submission. And he responds, well, enter hero Simon Oxendine, who headed the Lumbee chapter of the Veterans of Foreign Wars, who flew more than 30 missions against the Germans in World War II. He had already fought and defended democracy overseas. And so when it comes to his back door, who was a cucumber, he responds, you said that, did he? Okay, we'll just wait and see. So in the end, 50 of the alleged 5,000 Klansmen show up in this dark field. They set up their paraphernalia, turn on a little light bulb powered by a generator, and all of a sudden they are surrounded by 500 Lumbee who holler and shoot their rifles in the air, scare the Klansmen out of their wits. They scatter, run off into the woods, and the Lumbees stay behind and have a big celebratory party. So this is Simon Oxendine on the left, and this image ended up making the cover of Life magazine as the story made national news. The Klan was a laughingstock over this. And so asking students to spend some time with these primary source images is really powerful. There's such spirit in these two men. That wink kind of sums up the entire victory, I'd say. And the great folk artist Malvina Reynolds wrote a song about this, performed by Pete Seeger, which you'll play for your students and have them dive into the lyrics to kind of tell them a little bit more about the story and how it was perceived. So I'm going to let you take a quick listen here to the Battle of Maxton Pond.
Oh, have you seen the bedsheet boys, the terrors of the night? They rallied here at Maxton, just honing for a fight. Rally round, you clansmen bold, but do not show your face. We'll burn the fiery cross tonight and save the Nordic race. Oh, the clan, oh, the clan. It calls on every red blood fighting man. If you are free and white and bigot, and get your courage from a spigot, they be needing reinforcements for to fight the Indian. Now the Indians, they are our natural foe. They lure our girls with coke and pie, take them to a show. They wear blue jeans and leather coats, but anyone can see they are not real Americans, the like of you and me. Now the headlights shone, the clansmen stood encircled, brave and fine, when suddenly a whoop was heard that curdled every spine. An Indian youth with steely eyes, he sauntered in alone. He calmly drew his shooting iron and conked the microphone. Oh, the clan, oh, the clan. It calls on every red blood fighting man. If you are free and white and bigot, and get your courage from a spigot, they be needing reinforcements for to fight the Indian. Now another shot, the lights went out, there was a moment's hush. Then 100,000 Lumbee boys came screaming from the brush. Well, maybe not 1,000,000 quite, but surely more than 4. The clansmen shook from head to foot and headed for the door. Now the troopers, they were down the road, they did not lift a gun. They heard the noise, they said the boys are having a little fun. But when they saw the nightshirt lads streaming down the road, they knew that something went amiss, the wrong switch had been throwed. One lonely clansman in the brush the troopers chanced to find. The convocation ran away and left me here behind. He staggered home that greenish morn to greet his loving wife. She beamed him with a rolling pin for losing her kitchen knife. Oh, the clan, oh, the clan. It calls on every red blood fighting man.
So one of my absolute favorite pieces of this story is what happened to Catfish Cole's wife, the lonely clansman in the bush, right? So it said that while her husband is hiding in the woods, she gets so panicked that she drives their car into a ditch and gets stuck. And so what happens, the Lumbee, as true gentlemen, come, get her pushed out of the ditch, get her safely on her way, and then they throw a huge party, wrap themselves in the clan paraphernalia, and really just have a celebratory time out there while the clansmen hide in the woods and slink away. So listen, teaching about Jim Crow is hard history. Teaching about hate groups like the KKK, it's hard history. And teaching the marginalization, the genocide, the terrible things that have been done to indigenous populations is also really hard. And yes, we have to do all of that. We have to face all of that. But here is an amazing example of how we can still highlight the stories of triumph and perseverance, such as this one, even while we make sure to shine a light on all those past wrongs.
So the tribe actually started paying tribute to the Lumbee who stood up to the Klan. They started this back in July 2004 when they honored 146 Lumbee men and women with a medallion. It was engraved with Lumbee Warrior in 1958 and surrounded the tribe's logo. And they've continued to recognize this brave and courageous act. And I really think this should be taught in every classroom in the state. The tribal chairman, Jimmy Goins, at the time said, "We want to take the time to honor these heroes who fought against the injustice and bigotry of the KKK. They stood not just for the Lumbee, but for all minorities." And I think the most powerful part of this lesson that we have on the Battle of Hayes Pond really leads me right into my next recommendation, which is using primary sources. I think most of us understand the importance of primary sources in the classroom at this point. This is history in the raw. This is where you get to go beyond the filtered textbooks and articles, and students can really start to get a sense of life and blood and sweat and tears and humanity, all that is history, because after all, it's the story of us, not the story of dates and places and names and the branches of government. So, if you remember that look on the face of Simon Oxendine and that wink, that is more powerful than any article you can read. And so primary sources are an amazing platform for teaching the all-important analytical skills. Again, we aren't telling students what to think. We are teaching them how to think. But with everything, we also need to constantly reflect on the primary sources we choose to use and try to use this opportunity again to cover a more comprehensive and complex narrative. So what do I mean by that? We all know that when teaching about the civil rights movement, images are so powerful. Having students evaluate the images of protests and seeing what protesters endured, seeing what they stood up to and fought back against is a really powerful lesson. But images like the ones that you're looking at, as important as they are, they're also not the entire story. So there are also images like this, for instance. So just take a moment to take this in and think about, how does this image differ from the traditional images of civil rights protests that we typically see? You see, now we complicate the narrative and go beyond just passive nonviolent resistance to another equally but much less covered aspect of the civil rights movement, which was Black self-resistance. Sometimes even, brace yourself, armed self-resistance. I'll let you go off on your own and check out our program on Union County's Robert and Mabel Williams for more on that. But this quote from Martin Berger, the curator of a collection of civil rights photographs called Freedom Now, argues that the best known images of the civil rights struggle show Black Americans as non-threatening victims of white aggression. So this imagery helped garner the sympathy of liberal whites in the North for the plight of Blacks. But it did so by preserving a picture of whites as powerful and Blacks as hapless victims. So these are really important conversations to have with students. And again, to teach a history that is empowering, even when it's hard. That doesn't mean you don't teach the images on the left, but you do teach how those were strategically planned protests, why those images were so important, but then you also teach the image on the right, that spirit of the fact that people did fight back in a myriad of different ways. And the other thing I think primary sources can do is break apart the mythology. Dr. Charles Payne speaks a lot about how the failure to include attention to Black self-defense and resistance in our teaching of Jim Crow and the movement has created a history more theatrical than instructive. So we celebrate a few prime names and sanitize the story to the point that students miss the fact that these were ordinary people doing extraordinary things. Instead, we need students to see themselves in our past heroes. And I think, again, primary sources can really help for that. For instance, why not throw an image of Dr. King in there like this? So I want you to pause for just a moment and look at this and think, how does this image differ than those that we typically see of Dr. King? So in this image, I see a really young man. I see joy. I see a person instead of an icon. And this is actually an image of Dr. King in St. Augustine, Florida, after just learning that the U.S. Senate passed the Civil Rights Bill on June 19th, 1964. So the last recommendation I'll share with you today, and again, these are just a few out of many, keep in mind, but it's to pay attention to the language you use, the questions you ask, and really be mindful of how you frame things. Whenever possible, draw attention to the themes of humanity, individuality, and agency. This is how we cultivate all-important empathy. And again, as I said earlier, there is a big difference in the language of victim and what that conveys versus the language of survivor. And I think one of the best examples of what this actually looks like in the classroom is when teaching slavery. So Dr. Hassan Jeffries wrote that finding the promise and possibility within this history, the history of slavery, requires us to consider the lives of the enslaved on their own terms. Trapped in an unimaginable hell, enslaved people forged unbreakable bonds with one another. No one knew better the meaning and importance of family and community than the enslaved. And they fought back in the field and in the house, pushing back against enslavers in ways that ranged from feigned ignorance to flight to armed rebellion. There is no greater hope to be found in American history than in African Americans' resistance to slavery. But to pull that out, to pull that promise and possibility and hope out, you have to think about how you frame your teaching of slavery. And I think it starts with some simple attention to the words you use. For instance, the term slave in many ways conjures up an archetype. We need to constantly remind students of the humanity by teaching about enslaved people, individuals who had hopes and dreams, and despite the unjust situation they were in, many persisted and resisted and carved out various forms of freedoms for themselves as best they could in an unimaginably oppressive situation. We need to constantly lead discussions that breathe heart and life into this hard history so that students can find that hope despite all the hard. Now, our state in particular offers endless opportunities to show that slavery wasn't a simple binary. It's not that people were either enslaved or they were free. Actually, below the surface, there was a lot more complexity and community. Our state, for instance, is riddled with the histories of enslaved North Carolinians who sought or defined freedom for themselves, from those who chose to run away, to free and enslaved people who assisted the freedom seekers in escaping, to rich and complex communities that were formed between enslaved and free people. If you look at this map by the North Carolina African American Heritage Commission, you'll be reminded that North Carolina is covered in what they call freedom roads. These rivers, our state is just covered with rivers and bodies of water, almost like veins. And these bodies of water served as a means of escape, as a means of information, of community, and so much more. And so you'll find in Carolina K-12's database lesson plans that elevate the various ways Black people strove to experience varied concepts of freedom through their individual agency, through their collective agency, and as always, through resistance and resilience, whether it was in the Great Dismal Swamp or the rich maritime communities and maroon settlements that free and enslaved Blacks formed, or via North Carolina's own Underground Railroad. And honestly, one of the most simple and powerful ways to do this is by exposing students to runaway ads, which are now available through UNCG. They have this wonderful online database where you can search ads by North Carolina County. So that becomes even more closely history your students can touch. And I want to just take a minute for you guys to meet Kirk. Kirk fled enslavement from Guilford County. And as I read through this ad, I want you to listen and take note, jot down what you hear, some of the skills and traits that Kirk possesses. And some you might see direct evidence of in this ad, and others you might infer. Ran away on the 19th of February last, a Negro man named Kurt, between 20 and 30 years old, 5 feet 10 or 11 inches, very Black, cunning and artful, can write a tolerable good hand. It is probable he has a pass with the number of names counterfeited to it, and he may attempt to counterfeit the county seal. Speaks quick, is a little hollow-eyed, rather knock-kneed, had with him leather breeches, a linsey coat, other clothing not recollected. It's possible he will change his clothing and make use of many devices to deceive the people, as he has a great deal of assurance. He has no motive in running away but to get free, and may attempt to go to the Ohio or Delaware or the lower end of this state. The above reward will be given by the subscriber living in Guilford County, etc. So Asking your students to examine an ad like this and think about Kirk's skills, his personality, his ambitions, and his intentions, discussing the realities and risks that freedom seekers faced. Let's keep in mind what the North Carolina landscape looked like during the years of slavery and what it would take to survive physically and mentally. And we also see mention of the fact that Kirk might be running south. Why in the world would a freedom seeker go deeper south? To find family, to find loved ones that were likely sold away at other points. And the last thing I'll say on this is that North Carolina has some incredible stories of enslaved people stealing their freedom, as Dr. Freddie Parker would say, and going on to do amazing things. So just two quick examples. Number one, Moses Roper, born into slavery in Caswell County, North Carolina in 1815, and after 17 attempts to escape, he was finally successful in his early 20s. He makes his way to Britain, writes a narrative sparing no detail regarding the brutality of enslavement, and becomes a renowned abolitionist speaker right there at the level of Frederick Douglass, who is much more known. But few know the name of this North Carolina man who was basically a relentless abolitionist. One more, and then I'll stop. This woman, does this look like your typical vision of an enslaved person? In 1818, Elizabeth Lizzie Hobbs was born enslaved in Virginia and loaned to a family member of her enslaver. So in 1835, she ends up here in North Carolina in the town of Hillsborough to live with the Burwell family. And her early life is much the hard reality that we are used to when learning a true history of enslavement. It was brutal in so many ways, and part of our responsibility is to face that history. So for 6 years, with the Burwells in Hillsborough, Elizabeth said later in her memoir, she did the work of 3 servants. She was beaten. She was also repeatedly assaulted for 4 years by a local white man, resulting in her son, George. But, spoiler alert, things change for Elizabeth. She goes on to purchase her own freedom, start her own dressmaking business, and becomes seamstress to the political elite at the time. So again, having students examine, for instance, her dress designs and think about what skills it took to design something like this in 1861, and letting them know that these were also designs for Mary Todd Lincoln, to whom Elizabeth Keckley becomes her personal dressmaker. And in the First Lady's own words, they become best friends. So Keckley, during this time, also founds and serves as the president of the first Black Contraband Relief Association to assist freed refugees streaming into the nation's capital. She eventually writes a memoir, Behind the Scenes. And again, these are just 2 of so many figures from our state who have incredible stories to engage your students with. Remember where we started, with the wise words from David Sloselsky about Abraham Galloway, the struggle and the joy, places and things that happen that we can draw strength from, inspiration from, get a better lesson on who we are as we try to fashion a future in this crazy new world we're in.
So remember, these are just a handful of recommendations to get you started. I think perhaps the most important thing you can take away is just to plan. This work is important. It's not to be taken lightly, but it's also not rocket science. You can do this. You're already doing this. Keep learning as much as you can. Build those relationships. Do no harm. North Carolina's civil rights leader, Pauli Murray, said, "It has taken me a lifetime to discover that true emancipation lies in the acceptance of the whole past, in deriving strength from all my roots, in facing up to the degradation as well as the dignity of my ancestors." And I think this quote is really relevant, regardless of who your ancestors are. If they were perpetrators or survivors, if they were powerful or disempowered, we need to open our eyes to the whole past in order to derive strength from it. That is why this work is critical. So in these last few minutes, I want to encourage you to spend time thinking about preparation for teaching hard history with success. And again, this is going to look very different for every teacher, for every school, even for every class within your school. There is no one size fits all approach. If there was and I could sell it, I'd be rich. So I'm going to spend these last 10 minutes sharing some kind of universal recommendations. But always remember that how this plays out is largely about the relationships you have within your school and your community. So before we move into this, I do want to take a minute and have you think about what you believe your challenges are to teaching hard history effectively and successfully. What are your worries? What are your fears? What keeps you up at night? If the answer is nothing, I'm good, then great. Turn off your computer and go take a nap. But if there's any part of you feeling unsure or ungrounded about anything, take some time right now just to pause me and jot that down. Or better yet, chat with a colleague about what might get in your way. So as we move into some suggestions for preparation and preparing how to do this work safely and effectively, one really great place to start is actually the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. Specifically, they offer some excellent guidelines for teaching the Holocaust that are really applicable to teaching any hard history. And I highly recommend you go and review those. They include a lot of the same recommendations we've already talked about, but they also do a deeper dive into how to navigate the complexity. For instance, it's really important to make responsible methodological choices. That's critical. And so one example they provide of this, which I think applies to most topics of hard history as well, is to refrain from simulations or games that can lead to a trivialization of the subject matter. So I want you guys to be careful with role plays and even creative writing activities. Be really mindful of whose mindset you are asking your students to step into and how you're asking them to do that. So let me be really clear. That's not to say that creativity and dramatic art doesn't have a place in the history classroom. Far from it. Vetted art and activities can lead to some of the most powerful moments with your students, but you need to really think this through so that you don't trivialize or romanticize or lose sight of that all important critical analysis that we are seeking from our students. Moving on, I don't think any of these are surprising, but it's important to communicate with your school leaders about what you plan to do, stay in touch about what you are doing, and always show how this connects to the standards and skills that you're tasked with. And this shouldn't just be looping your administrators in if something tricky takes place or goes not quite how you'd hoped in the classroom. They need to know about all the great learning happening in your classroom too, those deep and civil discussions that are going to happen, the insights that students are going to bring that literally knock you over. They're so deep. You know, invite your leaders into your class and let them see this work in action. That's the best proof of its importance, and that's how to get them excited about it also. It might be helpful for you to also seek out partners and advocates. It's not all on you, so don't take the weight of the world on your shoulders. Maximize those experts in your area and across the state. This can be local history museums or the State History Museum. It might be a nearby community college or university. Just know what resources might be helpful and reach out and tap into them. Relatedly, you might want to think about forming a school-based curriculum committee or even a school-based teaching hard history committee to get that specific. And the purpose and the structure should be based on your needs, but this could do everything from be a committee that works together and talks through lessons and topics that are considered potentially difficult. You guys might vet each other's work and intentions and strategies. But this committee could also serve as a means of support. So if you're challenged, a complaint then goes to the committee to review and address, and it's not just one teacher hanging out there on their own. Teachers should definitely serve on the committee. At least one administrator should definitely be involved. But this committee too could involve outside experts and resources. Like I said before, somebody from your local colleges, universities, a representative from the NAACP, a museum staff person. There are so many options out there of people who can help if you just reach out to them. And, I can't stress transparency enough when teaching hard history. Keep everyone aware of what you're doing. Invite them into your class. Shout your intentions and objectives and the teaching standards you are hitting from the rooftop. Invite your parents and families in as partners. A great way to do this is at the very beginning of the year, share a welcome letter with your educational philosophy, your intentions, some bullet points from your syllabus, whatever it is you can do to give notice of who you are and what your plans and intentions are in a positive manner can really go a long, long way. And given that our history classes have sadly become a political battleground, preparation is really more important than ever. And it's worth repeating. You have to know yourself, you have to know your students, and you need to know your community. So there might be some general universal recommendations, but like I said earlier, every class and every school is made up of different personalities, different backgrounds, different levels of knowledge, different lived experiences. So you always have to constantly reflect on who your students and your families are, who you are. Based on that, how are you perceived? And be honest with yourself about what kind of relationship you have with students and families. And you have to think about all of this in combination, how that's going to play to the community in which you teach when you embark on traditionally tough or potentially controversial subjects. Let's hope that most of you can be trusted by your school community as the professional you are. But given all the divisiveness and controversy about every single thing in this upside down world we're living in, you should also prepare for what to do if you receive questions or any kind of negative feedback or challenges based on something that's going on in your classroom. How you respond is critical. Even though it seems to be everyone's go-to these days, and it can be challenging, don't jump to defensiveness or fear and never respond in anger. Before responding at all, really wait and consider the inquiry you've received, sit with it for a minute, and be willing to listen. Be ready to converse about your intentions that you've certainly determined well before entering into this work, and be ready to explain and justify your reasoning and teaching methods. You might want to even seek counsel from a colleague and talk things through with someone you trust first. And when you respond, always do so with transparency and warmth. Thank you for contacting me. Of course, I would love to discuss my methodology and how this relates to the North Carolina Standard Course of Study. Absolutely, I want to hear more about your concerns. I'm sure together we can figure this out. This is like classic conflict resolution 101, right? So, and we know you always start any conversation, written or verbal, with something positive. If the person you're speaking to is a parent, share something authentically positive about that person's child, and always thank them for taking the time and interest to come to you. This is, again, taking the high road 101. So if you're meeting face to face, depending on the situation, you might find it helpful to have a third party involved. And after any conversation, whether it was in person or over the phone, I recommend always following up in writing with a written summary, just some bullet points of the conversation. And this is really for your own documentation. And let me be very, very, very clear. Do not allow yourself to be attacked unfairly, to be treated with a lack of respect, or to be devalued as the professional scholar that you are is 100% unacceptable. That leads me to my final and probably the most important point from our hour together, which is thank you. Thank you for your service. Thank you for everything that you do. You are doing a great job. Let me say that again. You are doing a great job. You know, teaching anything is hard. And teaching hard history is also and can be especially hard. And so, you know, every time I spend any time with our state's teachers, I am constantly blown away by you. I am knocked over by your professionalism, by your patience, by your flexibility, by your fortitude, by your willingness, despite all the challenges, to keep showing up. And so I just want to say you are amazing. You are the glitter and the glue, and Carolina K-12 is here to support you with whatever you may need. And despite all the noise and all the rhetoric and all the drama, please remember you do have power. Amanda Gorman beautifully wrote that being American is more than a pride we inherit. It's the past we step into and how we repair it. Every day you step into the classroom, you have the chance to repair, to change, to empower. Never forget that. So in closing, I'd like for you to take some time to just reflect on what we've talked about, either in discussion with colleagues or just in a personal reflection. Consider the questions that you see here. And while you do that, I'm going to close and leave you with your own thoughts and planning, and also the powerful words of Kwame Alexander reading his poem, The Undefeated, which will hopefully propel you into a successful school year. Despite the challenges ahead of us, many perhaps unknown, you remain undefeated. Thank you for your time, and thank you for your service.
This is for the unforgettable, the swift and sweet ones who hurdled history and opened a world of possible. The ones who survived America by any means necessary, and the ones who didn't. This is for the undeniable, the ones who scored with chains on one hand and faith in the other. This is for the unflappable, the sophisticated ones who box adversity and tackle vision, who shine their light for the world to see and don't stop till the break of dawn. This is for the unafraid, the audacious ones who carried the red, white, and weary blues on the battlefield to save an imperfect union. The righteous marching ones who sang, "We shall not be moved because Black lives matter." This is for the unspeakable. This is for the unspeakable. This is for the unspeakable. This is for the unlimited, unstoppable ones, the dreamers and the doers who swim across the big sea of our imagination and show us the majestic shores of the promised land. The Wilma Rudolphs, the Muhammad Alis, the Althea Gibsons, the Jesse Owenses, the Jordans and the LeBrons, the Serenas and the Sherrills, the Reese Whitleys and the undiscovered. This is for the unbelievable, the we real cool ones. This is for the unbending, the black is the night is beautiful ones. This is for the underdogs and the uncertain, the unspoken but no longer untitled. This is for the undefeated. This is for the undefeated. This is for you and you and you. This is for us.